Welcome everyone to this webinar. Thank you for joining us. I am Gia and I'm going to hand over to the chair for this afternoon, whom is Brian Ashley.
Hello everybody. It is great to be with you, and in some places it's appropriate to say good morning to our friends and comrades in Latin America, South Africa, and in other places in Africa and Europe, I suppose it's good afternoon. And of course, to our good friends in Asia, it's good evening. So welcome to you all, and welcome to this webinar organized by the Alternative Information and Development Center, AIDC, the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, the Committee for the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt, and Global Justice Now, and of course, Jubilee Sur, Jubilee South Americas. A very warm welcome to our panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment, but my name is Brian Ashley from the AIDC. I must say it is particularly pleasing to be joined by comrades and friends with whom we've stood shoulder to shoulder in the struggle to end debt bondage, from the days of the 1999 mobilization at the G7 meeting in Cologne, the Jubilee Summit we held in Mali in December 2000, where we assessed the gains of the Jubilee campaign as the 2000 deadline for debt cancellation was breached, the G7 meeting in Genoa, where our comrade Carlo Giuliani was shot and killed by the police, the many convergences we undertook within the World Social Forum, and as part of the broader anti-globalization global justice movement. And of course, at the Glen Eagles G8 Summit in July 2005, where supposedly the debt crisis of poor countries was resolved through the G8 leaders' commitment to cancel 100% of outstanding debts for those eligible, heavily indebted poor countries, the so-called HIPICs, to the IMF, World Bank, and the African Development Bank. And yet, once again, just as we were with the 2007-2008 financial crisis, we stand in the storm of a new economic crisis, where both the outstanding debts and the new debts many countries are being forced to incur will ensure that many deaths from COVID-19 happens, and as governments battle to find the resources to deal with both the health and the accompanying economic crisis. But equally, the current crisis must force us to look forward to the storms of the climate emergency, which will make the COVID-19 pandemic look like a bit of a Sunday picnic. If there's not a break with the neoliberalism, austerity, and privatization, the standard script of structural adjustment programs, when our countries will be overrun by social and economic and environmental disasters. So what we do now is going to be very critical for dealing with the crises to come. So it's in this sense that we're approaching this discussion with a great sense of urgency. We need debt cancellation. We need an end to the system of debt bondage, and we need the space to develop a just transition to a radical Green New Deal. For this, we need to renew our movements. We have to ensure the new generations build on the political and ideological achievements of the anti-debt campaign movements of the past. Here I have in mind our understanding of the role that debt plays in the subordination of the countries of the South, the role of the IMF and the World Bank in enforcing and reproducing the financial architecture that enslaves our countries, and what we argued in the early 2000s of the historical and ecological debt that the North owes the South, and the idea that we don't owe, we won't pay, as a slogan that gives the confidence for a radical movement against the debt. It also includes all the ideas around the illegitimacy of debt, for which the case of South Africa's apartheid debt was important, and the demand for debt audits. Of course, there have been many new issues and demands raised by many organizations that have continued to campaign against the debt. And I'm hoping that we are going to be able to discuss these in this webinar. For this, and for elaborating on some of the issues I've made reference to, we have a very strong panel of speakers with a long history of fighting against the debt and against the system of debt bondage. We will have Lidy Nacpil, who's from the Philippines and is the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, an activist, feminist, and campaigner for 40 years, and for somebody I've known for 20 of those years, I think. She will lead us and will be followed by Beverly Keene, who's an economist, a coordinator of Dialogo 2000, and coordinator of the Jubilee South Argentinian movement, and is a lecturer of human rights and culture of peace at the Faculty of Social Sciences in the University of Buenos Aires. Beverly will be followed by Eric Toussaint, who's a historian and political scientist and is a spokesperson for CADTM International and sits on the Scientific Council of Attack France. He's also have several books, and he has a long history, not of just being active in the anti-debt movement, but in the broader anti-globalization movement, like most of our speakers. And then we have, not least, Dorothy Guerrero, who is the head of policy and advocacy of the Global Justice Now, based in Britain, and is originally from the Philippines. She works with many social movements and NGOs over a long period of time, over 30 years, and she currently works on and writes about corporate accountability, climate justice, migration, China, trade and investment, and other economic justice concerns. That's our panelists, and as I mentioned, we will start with Lidy, but before we start, just a heads up on how our discussion is going to work. The panelists will have an opportunity to introduce the topic, each speaking for 10 minutes. Then we will have them doing another round, building on their inputs, perhaps answering some very specific questions which are pertinent to the debates and issues around rebuilding an anti-debt movement today. And then we're hoping, as the panelists are speaking, you, the audience, you, the participants, will be posting questions in the question and answer box, and we'll be filtering that. But we also hope to open it up for people to comment and to ask questions. The webinar is being interpreted into Spanish, and I'm going to hand over to Kia, who's just going to give us some house rules and explain a little bit technically how things will work, and then we will get moving with our discussion. And once again, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, namaste, bonjour to everyone. I would carry everything else, but just to say welcome to this webinar, and I'm the housekeeping comrade. So if comrades need interpretation, please go right at the bottom of the Zoom panel. There'll be a globe that says interpretation. So for our Spanish speaking comrades, please click on the Spanish channel, and you should be at the moment be hearing our comrade translator translating to you what I'm saying. And if you're facing some form of audio and technical difficulties, please make sure to click mute original audio. Mute original audio is the last option right at the bottom of interpretation. That would mean you will only hear the translator and not hear anything else. And if you're an English speaker, but for an example, there's a question asked in Spanish, please do click onto the English channel, and you will then hear the translator translating a Spanish question into English. The whole webinar will be conducted in English. So if you don't want to get any form of interpretation, you don't have to click onto the globe. You'll be able to hear the full webinar the way it is. Just to let comrades know that if by mistake you should drop off the call or drop off the webinar, you'll be able to receive a recording if you request it, and you can ask Emil Fiode for a recording. He will be posting his email address on the chat, and we're also live streaming on Facebook for those that would like to keep the conversation going there. Just to also remind comrades that there's a Q&A box right at the bottom, which is next to the globe of interpretation. So you click on the Q&A block box and you'll be able then to pose your questions there. Please take note to pose questions on the Q&A block and not your comments and thoughts, and not greetings either. Let's greet each other. Let's think and pose our comments on the chat block, and we will then be able to see you there and say hi to you on the chat block. Comrades, and also just to remember in terms of etiquette and house rules, don't post your question on the Q&A block and also on the chat box for emphasis. We do see your questions. We will filter the questions and let the panelists know there's a particular question they would need to attend to. We will also give a portion for comrades to intervene from the floor, and this will then be an opportunity for comrades to speak, and we will allow comrades that raise their hands to be able to intervene. Please take note to keep your intervention as succinct as possible so we can be all be able to engage with one another. Just to remind us all to please speak as slow as possible and enunciate every word so all of us can be able to understand, take part in the conversation, and that the translator can be able to translate as crystal clear as possible. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kia. This is a really challenging platform, this Zoom, and all the protocols that we have to observe. But as we get used to it, and as Lidy said in the prep, she's done thousands of these. She also probably doesn't need introduction to most of us. As we all know, Lidy's been an activist in the movements in the Philippines. She's been active in the anti-debt movement. She now plays a critical role in the climate justice movement, campaigning against coal. And we are very, very happy to have you with us today, Lidy. And you are going to kickstart this very important debate.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. And thank you, everyone, for coming to hear and discuss with us. I'm in the Philippines, and we have been in strict lockdown and quarantine since the middle of March. So it's been more than 2 months. And that is the context of my statement about webinars and web meetings, because that's all we can do these days in terms of reaching out and interacting with each other. I'm a little bit nervous because I was just told a few minutes before we started that instead of speaking third, I'm going to speak first. And I had assumed that Beverly would have been talking a lot and, you know, telling us a lot about things that I don't have to repeat. And now I find myself in this quite challenging situation. So first of all, I'd like to say that the title of our webinar, which is a renewal of the anti-debt movement, I think is quite appropriate, especially for the South. I think we need to acknowledge that for more than a decade, the debt movements in the South has not been as vigorous as they were during the time that we founded Jubilee South in 1999. And for the first decade into the new millennium, we have been, I think, quite successful in making sure that we change the terms of the debate and deal with the debt from a new perspective, which was historical and which took into account the illegitimacy of the debt problem, and start and push groups to start looking at debts not just in terms of sustainability, but also in terms of the illegitimate nature of the debts. Somewhere in the text of the description of this webinar is a phrase that says, how do we deal with the challenge of the new debt crisis. And I just didn't have the chance to ask my colleague, Brian and so on, about this term, new debt crisis, because in my view, there's not a new debt crisis. There's been a continuing debt crisis for so long. I guess when you know, I just like to share that when we were talking about the debt crisis, when we were discussing amongst ourselves as Jubilee South, one of the issues that we raised is the definition of a debt crisis, right? Apparently, for many of the international players and institutions, they only call it a debt crisis from the point of view of the lenders. It's a debt crisis when the borrowers are no longer able to pay on time and enough. But when they continue to pay, and they continue to pay on time, but at great expense to the lives of people, to the health of our economies, there's no debt crisis because we're paying. But from the point of view of peoples of the South, there is a debt crisis, and that crisis has been continuing. And it's not because we don't think the debt is no longer important. That's why our movements have not been as vigorous in the last decade. But it's also because it has been quite challenging to continue our work in the face of what many believe had a problem that had already been resolved, not just through HIPIC in 1999 and the year 2000, but also through the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative that was adopted by the G8 in Glen Eagles in 2005. But that was taking only addressing the debts of a few countries and only bilateral and multilateral debts. And we all know that the debt problem is far beyond simply the bilateral and multilateral debts, meaning those owed to governments. And it's not just a problem of a few countries. But the greatest indictment of the so-called debt relief programs is the fact that they were not aiming to really stop the debt problem for these countries. What they were aiming to do was to rehabilitate the economies of these countries so that they can borrow again. And worse, they will be borrowing again, no longer at concessional terms, but they were being ushered into borrowing from the financial markets. And that's part of the new situation that Brian has mentioned that we have today. A new situation that, in fact, some of our countries like Argentina and the Philippines were already facing in the 90s. The fact that a majority of the debt of Southern economies, of Southern countries today, are coming from borrowings from financial markets. And this type of debts is a problem that we are not as used to, or we don't have as many answers or, you know, complete answers in terms of strategies and how we deal with it. And that's part of the challenge that we have today. But yes, the debt is just rightly so coming to the fore again now, given the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis that is accompanying it, because our situation under COVID-19 is underscoring even further or even more deeply the very devastating impacts of having to devote a large part of public funds to continue to pay debts. And the great injustice of this is not just the huge amount that we're paying for the debts at the expense of many other important things like essential services, but because our people have not really benefited from most of these debts. And the second is that it's reminding us about the legacy of this debt problem that we have had for decades. And that legacy is the state of our health systems, especially our public health systems that, you know, not surprisingly is overwhelmed by the COVID-19 pandemic because they're not in a state to be able to provide what our citizens need. Of course, it's an unprecedented crisis, but the very miserable and sorry state of public health systems today is precisely because of the debt problem. Governments have not been investing, and conditionalities, economic conditionalities that have accompanied the debt have told us to privatize, have told us to commercialize the health institutions, meaning they may be still in public hands, but they behave and they are run as if they are private corporations. So this is an issue that is really important, very, very urgent to address, and it is a time to renew the anti-debt movement. But I just don't want to, I just want to acknowledge that many groups have continued to do the work, of course. The work has not stopped. It's just that we want to reinvigorate it, bring it to higher levels than they have been in the last 10 years. And I just like to mention very quickly 4 challenges or 5 challenges I think we really need to take up as we renew the anti-debt movement. The first challenge, and they're not in any order of importance, they're all very important. The first challenge is we need to fight for immediate measures to reduce the burden of the debt. And this is very immediate because our countries, we need the resources to be prioritized for meeting the needs of people in the light of the health pandemic and in the light of the economic crisis. We are making many demands from our governments for what to do, what to spend on, what we need, and there has to be public funds for that. So that is one urgency. We need these immediate measures. We need immediate relief. I hesitate to use the word debt relief because for those of us in the debt movement for a long time, debt relief used to be associated with the schemes of creditors that weren't actually providing us debt relief. But we really need real relief from these massive payments. And just to acknowledge and mention that we have actually joined many other organizations raising the call several weeks ago for outright cancellation of debt payments for 2020 and 2021, debt payments by governments, public debt payments. And we are calling for cancellation because it's not just enough to suspend the payments only to make them later, or only to postpone or delay our miseries, but to outrightly cancel the payments in the immediate, so that the funds that were allocated for payments of these debts can be used for people's needs at this very critical time. Part of that challenge is to oppose measures that are either short of what is needed. For instance, the IMF cancellation of just the debts of about 25 countries and, involving very little amounts. Not that we shouldn't accept that, but we should criticize that for being too little in terms of amounts and too few in terms of countries, or other measures that actually would be ending up even causing more harm. And those measures include, and I mentioned challenge number 2, new debts that are being accumulated purportedly to help countries respond to the COVID-19 crisis. So today, we just heard an announcement that the ADB is going to provide the Philippines with more than $400 million loan to help the Philippines meet the debt crisis, the COVID-19 crisis. So this type of measures should be opposed. We need to resist. That's the second challenge. The new loans that are being offered in the name of COVID-19 responses, because they will end up just deepening the problem of the debt for our countries. They should offer outright grants and not loans. The third, I think, very important challenge is we must use this crisis as an opportunity to call for more comprehensive measures to address the debt problem. It's not enough to just reduce the burden of the debt. This is what we need immediately, but it's not enough. We need this opportunity to reassert the calls that we have made for the last 2, 3, 4 decades to address the debt problem, to reassert the call for debt audits, to reassert the call to review debts, and to reassert the notion of illegitimate debts and the illegitimacy of the whole debt problem. We need to do this as part of the call to reboot and rebuild the economy. And we're being very deliberate here not to use the word economic recovery, because we don't want to recover simply back to the old system that exists, and then be normal in those terms, but to use this opportunity to rebuild the economy in a radically different direction, towards system change, towards building more equitable, just, and what we would call post-carbon and sustainable economies and societies. And lastly, that also means we need to take this opportunity to again reassert a more radical analysis of the debt problem, a historical, structural, political economy framing of the debt problem, which we have not been as vigorously doing in the last decade. So I think those are our challenges when we build a new debt movement and renew our anti-debt movement globally. Thank you so much.
Wow, thanks so much, Lidy. You really set the scene, and I don't know why you should have been concerned about going first. I think in the end it was very, very helpful. I'm now going to ask Beverly Keene from Argentina. And initially I had wanted you to go first, Beverly, because I thought you would focus us so much on the immediate issues by talking about the situation in Argentina and the debt standstill that we are at there once again. So Beverly Keene, who has been a coordinator of Jubilee South in the Americas, Latin America, let's ask you to continue taking us forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Lidy, for that excellent beginning. And thank you in particular to some of our colleagues from Latin America, Marta Flores, who is the present coordinator of Jubilee South in the Americas. It's very early in Central America, even worse than here in Argentina, although I must say they're more used to getting up at this hour than I am. Indeed, I think the Argentine situation is perhaps the worst point to begin with. I want to avoid, in a sense, talking too much about the Argentine situation. And that's because, as Lidy was saying, the reality of the debt crisis is not that of the lenders. It is a reality of the perpetual debt crisis that peoples throughout the South, and indeed in many parts of the North, are forced to pay. And that historical debt, that social debt, that ecological debt, and indeed the growing financial debt that needs to be reckoned with is a reality that goes far beyond the crisis countries like Argentina today, or Ecuador today, or even El Salvador today in Latin America. So, having said that, I will speak very briefly about the Argentine situation because indeed it is a critical moment for both the government strategy, which is a strategy, as always, to pay. It's a strategy to see how to reach an agreement with the creditors, as was done in 2005, the lenders, as we prefer to call them. And it's an agreement that the government is trying to seek at this time, which basically ensures, in a sense, that debt enslavement, ensures that the system of perpetual debt will continue. And that's precisely, as Lidy was suggesting, what we seek to focus on and we think is absolutely essential for the renewed debt movement to recover, in a sense, that critical analysis of the system of debt. The problem is not whether I can pay today. The problem is whether I should be paying, what it costs to pay, and indeed, what are the alternatives? And it's in that respect that the Argentine situation is very serious. Indeed, over the past 2 years, 20% of the federal budget is being gone to debt payments. And obviously that's related to the fact that poverty has almost doubled over the past 2 to 3 years. And it means that even before the pandemic hit our country, our region, our world, It means that the Argentine economy was already in a deep recession. So the economic costs of this particular moment will be dramatic. They will be long-reaching. It's very hard at this point to make any serious analysis of how we can begin to come out of this situation. And indeed, as Lidy was saying, not so much think about returning to some sort of normalcy, but rather how we can seek to use this opportunity indeed to advance real proposals, real initiatives for transforming the economy. And this is particularly so as we look at the debt in all of Latin America and over the past 20 years. One of the essential aspects for us of the debt is its relationship to I don't know how you say this in English. We're going back to the primary industries. So we're going back to economies that are based on the extractive sector. When we went to South Africa in 1999 to form Jubilee South, we were very fortunate to have with us colleagues who are still part of the movement in Ecuador and Latin America, colleagues like Aurora de Rosa, who posed at that time, and this was a critical element of our Jubilee South platform, to look at the reality of ecological debt and to look at the crisis, in a sense, in environmental terms, that the financial debt was already posing 20 years ago. And certainly if we look at the realities today, we see that that crisis is much worse. The impacts, the restructuring impacts of the debt in our economies in Argentina and throughout Latin America is profound. And even at this particular moment, both of the nature of the crisis in Argentina today and the reality of the economic structure that has been built in order to service the debt, not to service human rights, not to service the people, but an economy that is at the service of the debt, means that the extractive sector, so it's petroleum, it's mining, it's fracking, it's agribusiness, it's everything that leads to enormous contamination, enormous exclusion of the population. Those are the sectors to which the economy and the government looks to immediately in order to try to resolve its problem, which it defines as the inability to pay the debt. So the linking of the financial debt with ecological debt, with historic debt, with social debt, for us is critical. And again, to say this is not just a situation in Argentina, but throughout the region. And that means if we're looking at the movement today and the need to, and the interest in renewing indeed the debt movement, it means not only in a sense reasserting, as Lidy was suggesting, these historic demands, but also it means very carefully and very systematically looking at the strategies that we use to connect the debt movement with the struggles that are most important in our countries today. And the struggles in Latin America have a lot to do with facing the extractive industry. They have much to do with people recovering their cultural identities, their territorial control, the possibilities of indeed self-determination, the need for consultation before projects going on that indeed make life impossible for most of the communities. These are the realities of the debt crisis that is a permanent crisis in our countries. So we think that the debt movement today has to indeed base itself and work very closely together with the anti-extractives movement throughout the region. And of course, in a historic fashion, we have to build those ties with labor movement, with the women's movement, with all of the movements that today throughout Latin America are facing, in a sense, the impacts, not just of the neoliberal policies, not just of the debt crisis, but also a word that has been called into question by this crisis, which is that of globalization. the fact that over the past 20 years, in a sense, our economies have become more and more linked through the role of private finance and through the role of private goods, private corporations, also means that we have tremendous new discussions about the relationship with private and the public. And this is to say that even as we see states recovering, in a sense, at this point, a certain, a renewed vigor in their relationship to society, looking particularly at public health systems, we also see that our states have receded enormously in terms of not just the sectors of the economy, their presence in the economy, but also their capacity to deal with, to regulate what is the role of private actors. So I think this is also a very significant aspect that has to be dealt with in a much more systematic way in a renewed debt movement today. The role of private finance is tremendous. Many have seen that the verb of private-public finance, or I think partnerships, private-public partnerships, I'm not sure how you say it in English. It was just that, you know, how can the state make life easier for private finance? That's basically what the state does in most of our countries. And so here is a tremendous question for our movements as to how we can address indeed the role of the state as it seeks to, or as we want it, in a sense, to indeed regulate in a much more systematic way what is the intervention of private finance. So those are some of the issues. I think that we also, as we talk about renewing the debt movement globally, it is very important to recover, in a sense, and to strengthen our view and deeds of debt illegitimacy. And no better time than a time of tremendous crisis that we have, where we can say, as we have said for many years, that the debt is illegitimate, not just because of its historical context, the origins of the debt, we can bring those up to date. It is illegitimate because of the conditions under which it has been contracted and the conditions in which it is used, what it is used for. But the debt is also illegitimate because of the cost of servicing it. And we can see that today, as we look around our countries, as more and more budget space is sacrificed to pay debt, obviously less is available to service people's needs and to really direct economies at people's human rights. So in that respect, understanding the illegitimacy of the debt in those terms, its origins, its use, and also the cost of paying the debt, means that today we have a, I think, vital and a very possible terrain in which to rebuild some alliances south-south and also towards the north. A very important challenge, but something that's possible for all of us to do together. Thank you.
Thanks, Beverly. Thanks very much. I'm pleased you agreed to say something about Argentina, but we appreciate you reinforcing the structural and systemic analysis of the debt and raising the whole issue of illegitimacy and illegitimate debt, etc., as a key component of our analysis going forward. I think that on that basis, it's important then to bring Eric Toussaint from the Committee for the Cancellation of Illegitimate Debt into our discussion. And it's a great welcome to you, Eric, and thanks for joining us. And we give you 10 minutes. You're muted. Unmute.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. It's really a pleasure to share this panel with Lidy, with Beverly, with Brian, with Dorothy, and all the participants from all the continent. I was asking you, Brian, if you have any question to me, but if you don't have question, I will, of course, take my points. Do you have a concrete question?
Oh, you have the opportunity to give an overview of how you see the situation now, in the current situation, for the next 10 minutes. Then we will have an opportunity to deal with some questions.
Okay, so I agree with Lidy and Beverly to say that there is no new debt crisis. There is a worsening in the debt crisis, and it is much more broader than 20 or 30 years ago or 40 years ago. It is broader because the situation is much worse at the level of the popular classes, at the level of the families. That the question of the household debt. We already had in the past, of course, the problem of the debt of the popular classes, but with the extension of the neoliberal policies and the offensive of the capital against labor at a world scale, the level of indebtedness of the families of the working class, of the popular classes, has risen a lot. And some activity around, or some businesses around the poorest, like the microfinance industry, is a new initiative of the capitalist system to exploit more the popular classes. Microfinance is, we are struggling as CADTM, as the Committee for the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt, against microcredit business, but also the question of the mortgage debt in countries like Spain or the USA, Greece now, where people are expelled from the houses. The question of student debt in South Africa, in Japan, in Chile, in the UK, in USA. The question of the student debt is a very important question. The question of the peasant debt in countries like India and a lot of countries of Africa. So struggling for the abolition of the illegitimate debt of the popular classes is a new priority for the movement we have to strengthen. The second thing is about what the lenders are doing now. A precision in relation to what Lidy has said. There is no cancellation from the IMF. There's it's a new, I don't know how you say that, arnaque in French or estafa in Espanol. The IMF is saying to the richest member of the IMF, please give some money to an ad hoc fund in which 20 poor countries can take the money to pay back us as IMF. So there is no cancellation and including no suspension of payment. The poorest country, helped by the IMF, will stay paying the IMF with the money of some richest countries. But this money given by the richest country should go to the people of this poorest country and not to the IMF. So we have to denounce what the IMF is inventing as a new way of presenting himself as a generous lender. And the Paris Club is repeating what he has done after the tsunami. Is postponing the payment of the poorest countries. And you have to take into account that the poorest country who will be able to postpone the payment are the countries who are not in arrears with the IMF and the World Bank. So some countries are immediately excluded from the list of the poorest who in principle can postpone the payment of the debt. Third point, I think that at the level of strategy is immediate suspension of payment, citizen audit of the debt to identify illegitimate, illegal, unsustainable, odious debt, and repudiation of the debt by sovereign countries, by the government, popular government, who decide to take a unilateral decision after suspending the payment to repudiate all the debt or the major part of the debt identified with the participation of the citizenship as illegal, illegitimate, odious, and or unsustainable. So it's very important. About a new debt movement, I think we have to reactivate the different networks. CADTM is very active and has expanded in, now we are present, active in 35 different countries. And of course we want to work, and we are working with Beverly in Argentina very actively. We are working with another network, Latin Dot, in other Latin American countries. We are working with Eurodat in Europe, and of course in Asia. Our comrades are collaborating with Asian South Pacific movement led by Lidy and his and comrades. I think I would say the priority for me would be to relaunch a broad political and social international movement, not only on the question of the debt. We have seen the crisis of the World Social Forum. The World Social Forum is not any longer active. I am a member of the International Council and founding member of the International Council, and I still receive the messages on the list of the International Council of the World Social Forum, but he has no capacity to mobilize. And so it's time to discuss between different networks, the feminist movement, the climate change movement, the movement against climate change or climate justice movement, the peasant movement, the question of the movement against the policy against migrants and other thematic, and to create a new broad social and political movement, including social movement and political organization. So not to repeat what we have done with the World Social Forum, who was excluding political organization and saying World Social Forum will not take any decision of action. We need a broad between social movement, political organization, convoking action. And there are some initiative in this direction taken by the MST of Brazil or the Comrade of NUMSA in South Africa and elsewhere. But we have to build something broader, more inclusive, and taking into account the lesson of the past. I don't know if I speak already 10 minutes or if I have 1 minute more.
You have 2 minutes, actually.
Okay, so I would say we need something broader than a new debt movement, because we are confronting with a multidimensional crisis of the world capitalist system. Maybe for the first time in the history, we have lived together, whether living in South Africa or in Argentina or Brazil or Belgium or Italy or India or China, exactly the same epidemic and more or less the same consequences because of the same policies. So, of course, since the last 2 centuries, the capitalist system had more or less the same policy against popular classes, but it's clearer now. And with the problem of the ecological crisis, we see also that we have the same problem in the north and in the south. At the level of the public debt, is incredible. Greece has 200% its ratio between debt and GDP, when Argentina, which is in default, partial default, is 60% of ratio debt to GDP. That's to say that several countries of the north are in a situation where the debt is more than 100% of the GDP. The case of Belgium, the case of Spain, of Portugal, of Italy, and other countries. So we are living really in the same condition with specificity, of course. The situation in Mali is not the same as the situation in Belgium, but we have the same enemies and we are confronted with the same problem. So we have to create a new, broad political and social organization capable to convoke to action. Thank you.
Thanks very, very much, Eric. Obviously, you are putting out a challenge for work that we do, and I think all the panelists have made the link, made the important point that the debt links to many different other areas and the multidimensional crises that we are facing, and that we can't simply take these up as single issues. And I think Dottie is in a good position to take us forward in the discussion as somebody who's active in global justice now, a movement that is taking up several of these issues, linking the financial crises that we're facing with the climate crises, with issues of trade and so on, but also looking at the geopolitical changes that we're facing, looking at the rise of China and so on. So it's a great welcome to you, Dottie, to take this discussion forward.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, and hello to everyone, whatever time zones you're in. This is really a good initiative to discuss and at the same time bring us back to this important moment as well, where we really need to rebuild the global anti-debt movement. For us also in Global Justice Now, we pick up this campaign again. We had been campaigning for this for many years before. And last March, when it became inevitable that the crisis will have an impact for a long-term impact, and it's not just a health crisis, but also will have a really massive economic implications. One of the first 2 or 3 campaigns that we focus on is on asking the government of the UK prior to the G20 meeting to have a position on canceling the payment of debt of developing countries. If we look at the global crisis, for those who have a memory of previous crises, it is very obvious that the coronavirus pandemic will be bigger than anything that we have experienced in living memory, and the economic impacts will be bigger. Also because previous crises, even war, have not entailed this near stopping of all economic activities. Due to health measures that were put in place, the restrictions on mobility and economic activities, the different levels of quarantine measures have virtually put economic activities on a full stop. So except for those deemed as essential goods, the fall in trade and export, the cessation of export, disrupted the whole global supply chain of production and produced a dual collapse of both demand and supply. Even on the most optimistic scenario, the World Trade Organization is saying that the trade will fall anywhere between 13 to 32% over 2020, and that is if lockdown will be lifted in early summer. The UN report also mentioned that there will be a 37% fall in the value of commodities, and then these are the commodities that many southern countries still depend on to earn dollars and to pay their debts. So the prediction is that there will be an 800 billion worth of collapse in export revenue. So all this rationale also point to the fact that for many developing countries, there's no other way to address the crisis but not to pay their debt and allocate those money to prop up their health systems and also their economic activities. In the North, we have seen that to avoid the collapse in the global financial system and also to save themselves and the panic that could ensue with the economic crisis, governments in rich countries did a reverse of what they normally say and do. So they intervened massively to prop up the economy since March. Without such massive intervention by major central banks, ranging from the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, and other institutions, we might be in a worse condition at the moment. We can also see that the US put up an impressive package, but it was able to do that because they have this privilege of being the holder of the world's reserve currency. And it gave them freedom for such action because they have that privileged position. But we can also see that other countries like Germany, for example, put a package which is equivalent to 5% of its GDP. Japan, even more, 20% of its GDP. Here in the UK, the fiscal remedy or what was put by the government would be around 350 billion pounds. And we were surprised about this, but also in a way, I think it is good that the government said that it is acting like it's a wartime government. And the chancellor or the treasury saying that they promise, Rishi Sunak promised to do whatever it takes to keep the jobs, to keep the economy afloat. So the thing is, for rich countries, there is that capacity, but for many southern countries that do not have such reserves and do not have such freedom to maneuver because they are indebted, then they have nothing else to do. By early April, around 85 countries already approached the International Monetary Fund for emergency assistance. And at the same time, I think it is easy to understand that developing countries and those in the least developed countries are caught in a we can call it a perfect storm. You have a collapsing global trade. There's also falling remittances from workers from those countries that experience job losses in the north. Being a Filipino, I'm aware that almost 10 to 12% of the foreign currency earning from the Philippines were remittances from those workers. And this actually doesn't come into many of the analysis, which which is a lifeline for many families in the South. And if their relatives that are working here in the North will lose their job, then that will be added to the misery. Also, this economic shock, this magnitude of economic shock also tells us very important lessons. And I think this was already mentioned by previous speakers, that number one, we could not carry on as before. And we should not carry on as before, because the old normal actually means death in terms of economic management, in terms of the climate change that it produces, and that we could not go on unsustainably, or the economies could not be managed, should not be managed as unsustainably as before. And what it also tells us is that if governments in the North can do that, then the governments in the South can say that, look, if you're doing it to your economy, then it's also good for us to protect ourselves, and at the same time use whatever left of the economic tools we can use. And the question now is, can developing countries default? There is a general agreement that the needs of society is actually far bigger than current capacity and actions of states. And for many developing countries, that means it might need to default on their debt payment. But we are also in a different conditions and political situations now than before. My husband reminded me that in the 1970s, Cuba actually hosted a conference on the need for the developing countries to act together and face their creditors. At the moment, we have that problem that, one, not too many developing country governments will have that strength or political power to do so. So it will be difficult for a single country to do that, to decide not to pay their debts. And also, in terms of legitimacy as well, I was reminded that when there was a shift in the political conditions in the Philippines, that was our demand to the government, that those odious debts and illegal debts should not be paid. I think I remember in South Africa, there was a similar debate when many campaigners tried to sway Nelson Mandela not to pay the foreign debt of South Africa, but those leaders still opted to pay the debt. So I think the question of why debt cancellation in the North, or at least here in the UK, there seems to be a friendlier or more sympathetic attitude to cancel the debt. When I was interviewed on Sky News a couple of weeks ago, I was quite surprised that the reporter was sympathetic to my view. Before you will get a very hostile interviewer if you say that we have to cancel the debt of developing countries. My sense is that there are more sympathetic view, but the common understanding of those who sympathize with the call is that, one, the debt cancellation is logical, and at the same time a charitable act from rich countries towards the poor countries. If the world is facing a health pandemic, and that even here in the UK, if we are facing the lack of ICU beds or ventilators, or we have an overstretched health system, what more in the developing countries? And that what more? How can developing countries can do physical distancing if they live in a shack where 7 or 8 people are residing? How can they wash their hands if there's no water, or if households will have to choose between buying soap or buying additional food? So the humane reaction is that it is okay to do so. But I think for us here in the North, what we must do in our education campaign, our political campaign, is to make or to develop a deep understanding and conscientization to the people here that debt cancellation is beyond financial help. That developing countries, to have a debt cancellation is actually giving for developing countries to have the freedom to use economic policies and have a maneuvering space to protect their economies too. it is actually like a liberation from the global financial and trade regime that for so long virtually empowered rich countries who are former colonizers of developing countries. So I think I am in this very funny position that before I'm campaigning from the South, and now I'm in developed countries. And most of the when we in the Global Justice Now were asked why we're campaigning, we're also saying that this is a way to to decolonize the control of southern countries through debt control from the North. Now, in terms of I think I will have the time to talk about what we're doing here in the UK, right? But I think before that, I will just echo what was mentioned, that the debt payment cancellation should be free of economic policy conditionalities. It should not be used to promote privatization, deregulation, and trade liberalization, because that will be like doing the old normal. And that it is not just a few campaigners in the North who are doing that. Actually, urgent calls for although they talk about debt relief, which Lidy mentioned as difference, the UN, UNCTAD, the prime ministers of both Pakistan and Ethiopia, the Ecuadorian Council, even the Vatican, even the Vatican were talking about debt relief. But we should push more. We should put the ceiling higher and say that relief is not enough. We need to cancel the debt for this year, because it would at least save $26 billion for developing countries, and if we extend it to next year, that will be another $20+ billion. I think my last point would be for campaigners here in the North, or at least in the UK, what we see is that even many NGOs and charities are more radical now, also in the calls. There had been a period where there's a depoliticization the politics here. It seems that the questions on system or regarding the system, calling for system change, it is stronger now than before, and that the call for cancellation, both multilateral, bilateral, or debts of developing countries to private institutions should be done. And I think in terms of this, an additional thing that I can add is that campaigners here in the North should also call to their governments that to prevent private companies or private banks not to buy the debts of the developing countries that will default, because that will give them an opportunity in the future to get their assets back, and that will be like what vulture funds is all about. And I think New York and London have that power because arbitration is being done here. So for us, if we can push for legislation here for the financial sector not to sue countries in the future, that will be important, and that will be key. Now, on building a global solidarity, I think some examples and bridging is important. There is a very strong campaign now for UN Treaty on Transnational Corporations that also connect with campaigning against certain banks. For example, last year there was a campaign against HSBC for those that are supporting the Ecuadorians on their fight against Chevron. There are many things that we could do now, and one of the things that I will echo with everyone else is that we should indeed think more global, and I think that is a challenge for many organizations in the North. My experience is that countries in the South, where I work with, in the Philippines, in South Africa, and also friends in Latin America, when they think of an issue, they think global. They think transnationalism, how to build bridges, how to build solidarity. So I think for us that's a challenge. How many campaigners here should not just worry about what's happening to us, but also what is happening to developing countries. I think I will stop there, and I hope I did not use more than my time. Thank you.
Thanks, Dottie. Always trying to remind oneself to unmute when we go between different formats. Thanks to all the panelists. Our original intention was to give them another opportunity to address a number of points that have been made by the different inputs. But I think with time running out and with the knowledge that there is a huge amount of analysis and knowledge sitting amongst the people who have joined this webinar, I'm going to propose that we open it up for questions and for comments and inputs, because if we are going to rebuild a global anti-debt movement, and if we are going to take up Eric's challenge of building a global political movement that can fill the vacuum that currently exists, then we need a lot of input and a lot of participation from a lot of people. And I want to give opportunity to the many friends and comrades from different movements that have joined us to raise questions, to raise comments, but please bear in mind, one, we have many Spanish speakers with us, and there's an interpreter who needs to interpret the questions into Spanish, or if they are asked in Spanish, to interpret them into English. So that means we also need to be very concise with our questions and precise with our comments. So I hope that it's possible for people to raise their hands, and I can indicate who wishes to speak and allow you briefly to input. It would also be very interesting for us to get an insight into the situation in your particular country or region that adds to the analysis that has been developed so far. We will give our panelists an opportunity to address the issues that you raise and conclude with final remarks just before the end of the webinar. So for the next 20 odd minutes, we're going to take inputs from the floor, so to speak. And as my father was keen on saying, don't all shout at once. I see some hands already. So I'm going to open it up to, I see Samantha. I see, hopefully I'm pronouncing the name right, Sridhar, and Mersha, and Marta. So in that order, we'll take those hands. And now I see many more. So Samantha, Sridhar, Mersha, Marta. We'll come back to Saeed and Farouk.
Great, thanks, Brian. Thanks to all the panelists. This has been a really fascinating, informative discussion. So my name is Woman. I work for the Woman African Alliance. We work on the African continent, obviously. So I wanted to echo and respond to a couple of points that you made. Eric, you really emphasized that this moment of crisis really offers an opportunity to start to bind together movements and struggles. And I think that definitely is what's happening on the continent here. So I think organizations that have never worked on debt before are now taking this up and integrating it into existing foci, such as anti-extractivist struggles, peasant movements, and obviously the climate movement, where the debt question is so resonant. So I just want to echo that in terms of the continent. I think there's another opportunity, and I have a frustration here because there are doors opening. On this continent, the African Union has made a distinct call, and it's not just for debt relief. There's actually been a call for debt cancellation. And so I feel there's an important opportunity that I don't think the debt movement on this continent right now is strong enough, or the movements aren't strong enough to take up the call and move with these voices that are actually coming from states and from multilateral bodies. So there's a frustration there. And I think the last point I want to make is just, Beverly, I think your pointing to the extractives question and the link to the debt is really critical. On our continent, in a number of countries, countries have actually sold their jewels, and they've done future trading, future agreement around the selling of their assets, their natural resource assets. And I think we're going to see another round, if we don't address the debt crisis again, of natural resources being traded for debt relief or new loans to pay existing debts. So thank you very much, everyone. It's been fascinating. Thanks.
Thanks, Samantha. Sridhar? Sridhar, are you there?
Sridhar's not around at the moment, but there comes
Oh,
Sridhar.
there. Okay,
Yeah.
thanks, Sridhar.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I just put it on the Q&A also. In most countries, and particularly our country, I'm finding that the debt relief is being sought by dirty companies only, and the governments, and many of them are restructuring their debts. What do the panelists think of how to meet this kind of a challenge where governments are saying that the economy has to be revived, and therefore a lot of debts and interests of companies, especially I find even extractives and other companies in India getting a lot of leeway from the banks and their debts. I would like to hear the panelists' views on that.
Thanks very much. Mersha?
So thank you everyone for a very stimulating conversation. I appreciated it. So I probably, along with you all, have been following this debt movement for a very long time. And I think Eric today initiated for me an aspect that has long been missing in our movement, because often the debt movement was a movement over there, far away from ordinary citizens who were ridden with debt of student debt, this debt, etc., going to the loan sharks and so on. So I think there is an opportunity to reimagine this campaign, that it's not just a campaign that is over there, that is a campaign that's often seen as far away from ordinary citizens. But when I talk to the members of the movement that I'm part of, the Rural Women's Assembly, they would talk to me about the everyday debt. We can't go and buy seeds because we owe X amount of money. We can't do this because we owe, etc., etc. So if we can, as we go forward, reimagine this campaign and have it from below as a citizens-driven campaign, which links in some of these issues, I think the campaign will be able to have much greater resonance, not up there far away from people's own realities. And I think this may have been something that was missing in the previous moments of campaigning around debt.
Thanks very much, Mersha. I'm now going to ask Saeed and then Farouk. Saeed?
Saeed, you're on mute.
Sorry.
Okay, unmute. Okay, thank you.
I forgot Martha, so Martha will come after you, Said. Sorry, Martha.
Martha.
Go ahead, Said.
Yes. Thank you for very informative discussion on the debt issues. We are countries of South facing the very critical situation before pandemic or now is worsened. So I'm very appreciate Lidy's word. It's not a new situation. It's continue. We are dating continue. Another is, I'm also agree with Eric. We need a new global initiative against debt. Just a little share the when the G20 countries decided to give the relief to the poor countries, it's only $1.5 billion relief to Pakistan, but its loans will be continued. It just say yes, you stop debt servicing during the pandemic, and few support by 200 million from World Bank, 300 million from ADB, but there are still loan which will we pay after pandemic. So from my side, I request to Lidy, we should demand all our members to every country reduce their military budget, the rest of money to divert in health benefits. And second, it's our initial demand. They all debts are illegitimate. So we again clearly say cancellation all the debt. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Sorry, Master, for missing you out. Please come in, Marta Flores.
Hola, buenos días. Bueno, primero agradecer, digamos, esta iniciativa y la posibilidad de ofrecer un espacio para no solo escuchar las experiencias y las posiciones de estas entidades que a nivel global estamos haciendo históricamente acciones en relación al tema de deuda. Creo que ha sido y puede ser una oportunidad significativa para poder empezar a replantearse, tal como se ha acá incluso colocado en términos de planteamientos, de ideas de posiciones. En nuestro caso, de Jubilee Suramérica, bueno, ya Beverly compartió muchos de estos elementos que hacen parte también, ¿no?, de estas acciones, de esta línea y de los posicionamientos que estamos empujando y de lo que estamos también repensando. Y sobre esto último, sobre el cómo repensamos y el cómo actualizamos también, no solamente la narrativa, sino cómo esto se puede complementar en relación a las necesidades más concretas, más inmediatas, que tiene que ver con el día a día de las poblaciones más, digamos, más vulneradas, ¿no? Entonces creo que es importante que podamos también colocar en el centro del debate qué está en juego. Que está en juego está no solamente la posibilidad de la refinanciación de un sistema corporativo, en juego está realmente muchas y casi todas las manifestaciones de vida, empezando por la humanidad. Esto es un elemento que para nosotros desde la red es fundamental, digamos, colocar, porque por eso decimos que la vida tiene que estar por encima de la deuda, porque efectivamente es eso lo que está pasando y se puede manifestar en diferentes escenarios, con diferentes magnitudes en un lugar u otro. Lo segundo que quería aportar es también la iniciativa que nosotros tenemos, que ya hacía parte de nuestro plan estratégico que aprobamos en el 2019, y era que hacia el 2020 iríamos a iniciar una campaña en relación a la deuda, que ahora nos estamos replanteando y que ahora estamos también intentando reconectar algunos de estos elementos sobre el actual contexto, sobre el escenario, pero también pensando cómo podemos juntar, cómo podemos abrirnos para poder empujar esta iniciativa. Así que celebro mucho de lo que ustedes han hablado sobre estas iniciativas y podemos entonces conversar en relación a cómo podríamos articular algunas acciones de tal forma que nos sumamos todas a acciones coordinadas en función de estas posiciones y en función de poder avanzar. Así que muchas gracias y estamos por acá entonces.
Just to mention to comrades, there was obviously not clarity.
Thanks very much, Marta. I unfortunately couldn't hear the translation. I'm not sure if the panelists were able to hear it. I'm hoping they were. I wasn't able to change my channel to the unmute original audio. That would have blocked out the Spanish. So it's difficult for me to relate to the point Marta made, but I'm hoping the panelists were able to get the important input from Marta. A thumbs up would be helpful if you were able to hear her, or else I would ask the interpreter just to repeat the main points that she made. Dorothy, Lidy?
Why can't you hear me?
You heard?
Why can't
No.
you hear me?
Beverly, perhaps you could just translate.
Yeah, because the problem is we're hearing both the English and Spanish at the same time. It's confusing.
Yeah.
Even if we mute the original audio, as we were told, the Spanish was still coming through.
Sorry, comrades. Can I just interrupt for a second? Could we maybe just ask Marta Flores to write the question in the chat, and then the interpreter can maybe translate the question and put it into the chat for everyone to see?
I think there's another option, and I'm hoping Beverly, maybe who listened to the Spanish, could just give a brief summary of Marta's input.
Indeed, a brief summary.
Unmute.
Sorry. I look like, can you hear me?
No.
I've unmuted. You can hear me now?
I hear you. At least, personally, I hear you. I don't know the others, but...
Can the rest of you hear me? Yes? No? Okay, well, just a very brief summary indeed. Marta was commenting on the importance, Marta as the coordinator of Jubilee South Americas, the importance of indeed rethinking our narrative and including and really focusing on the way that the population on the ground in the territories is affected and is made much more vulnerable by both the debt crisis and the global economic crisis and obviously the pandemic. And that as part of our efforts in the Americas, in the region, it also means very much trying to connect the debt campaigning to the needs and how we respond to the needs of the populations that are most vulnerable and that are most impacted both by the debt and by the pandemic. And this really means emphasizing at this time more than ever the slogan of life before debt. That's what we want to be focusing on. And Marta also commented that as Jubilee South Americas, we are preparing to launch a major campaign in the region. And as part of that campaign, we very much want to articulate actions globally. And I will just take advantage, this was not a detail that Martha sent, but it seems to me one of the last decisions we made in the global debt movement in 2010, 2011, I don't remember what, has to do with, in a sense, the continuity of the Global Week of Action on Debt. And we even looked at dates that might be useful every year. And if I remember correctly, they were October 8th to 15th, and recognizing the importance of Thomas Sankara's assassination and what after his call for debt cancellation. And it seems particularly relevant for us, at least all, to be thinking about this as we move forward, given that the IMF and World Bank meetings this year will take place, I think, on the 16th and the 17th of October. So the timing couldn't be better if we want to have a horizon of thinking about a time in which indeed we can join actions globally. So I say that's a bit of an addendum, just the precision, but Martha was raising that and saying that Jubilee South America is eager to enter into this discussion as to how we can indeed articulate actions globally.
Comrades, you can hear me, but I've lost sound. So I'm going to suggest that what we do is we ask our panelists to respond to the questions, or let me give Farouk a chance, and then ask the panelists to respond to the questions, and we round up our discussion. So Farouk, I'm getting, hello?
Yeah, thank you.
I'm getting sound again, thanks.
Thank you very much. It was very It was very much effective webinar, and I was really happy to see all the main campaigners against debt on this webinar. And I also see not much difference of strategy among the speakers here. All agree on the cancellation of debt. In Pakistan, Imran Khan, the Prime Minister, is very much appreciated that he's talking about debt relief. But he's not talking about debt relief, what Lidy was saying earlier about the real debt relief. It's just postponing the debt for a while, but we want just cancellation of the debt. And I would suggest that this cancellation of debt must be linked to a very clear demand: health for all, health for everyone, free health for everyone. That has to be made absolute clear in our campaign, because that is the consciousness we are dealing at present time. And I also agree with Toussaint's suggestion about a new global initiative, a new global campaign of movement linking different social and political movement, and to start, unlike the past, what we have gone through, the experience of World Social Forum. Thank you. Over.
Thanks very much, Farouk, and thanks to all the inputs and questions from our participants. As I said, I'm going to hand over to them to conclude and bring some ideas together around how we go forward. But having said that, and many of you have said, you know, the great levels of unity between our speakers, and how that sets a basis for pulling together a strong global anti-debt movement linked to both immediate struggles of our people and their problems with the debt, but also with the bigger issues, the connections with the most immediate struggles, struggles for health and the broader struggles against neoliberalism. The points that Beverly makes about the linkage between the debt crisis and the extractive industries. And one of our speakers, one of our panelists' questions was making the point about how our governments are beginning to bail out the dirty industries, the dirty companies, the fossil fuel companies, etc. So, of course, that link is important. But having said all that, and having looked at, taken into account all the sort of levels of unities, there are some big challenges that we faced in rebuilding, renewing an anti-debt movement. How do we get beyond some of the key divisions that existed in the previous movement, where we focused, or where parts of the movement wanted to focus on what was pragmatic, what was doable, or what they thought their governments could do? So we focused on the poorest countries. Well, what about the debt of the so-called developing countries? And then today, can we ignore the debt of Greece? Can we ignore the debt of Italy and Spain and so on? Is it just an issue of third world countries? Surely the debt has taken on a new form. Secondly, what about the issue of what Lidy raised about, and Beverly, I think, about the issue of the financial markets and the debt owed to pension funds, in which probably several of us have investments? Who takes the hit when and should those debts be cancelled? And part of the motivation for having this discussion was really a very particular situation that we are facing in South Africa, where a new generation of activists haven't been schooled, and maybe that's our mistake, in the historical analysis of the debt, etc. And when confronted with the position and the extreme crisis that our governments are in, and Dottie painted that picture very well, the collapse of commodity prices, the current account deficits now that export trade has collapsed, and so on and so forth, and the huge demands that we are making, and the problems of the lockdown, and the general economic depression that we're going to face. Why shouldn't we go to the IMF? They're giving us concessionary loans. What about engaging about the IMF giving us access to the special drawing rights, which we can use to get out of this crisis? There are several of these issues which I suspect we're going to find difficult getting broad unities around. So I'd like to introduce that into your closing remarks, to reflect on some of the challenges that we face in actually building this global movement. And I would also like to ask you to comment a little bit about all of this in relation to how you see the sort of general balance of forces, because when Cuba organized that conference on debt and called for collective debt repudiation, between the North and the South, there was a different balance of forces. There was the midst of the big movements against for national liberation that it could be linked to. We had the non-alliance movement as powerful, etc. We face a completely different situation today, made more complex, I suspect, by the interventions of China. It's not only debt that we owe to the IMF and the World Bank, it's debt that we owe to China, India, and other sort of BRICS countries, developing countries, and so on. So there are a number of complexities and tactical and strategic questions a renewed debt movement would have to face. So I'm going to ask all of you to, as best as you can, and comment on that which you feel most comfortable and you think is most relevant in 3 or 5 minutes to make some closing remarks and give us a sense of what's the way forward. Thank you very much. I'll start with Lidy, and then we go in the same order that we went. So Dottie, you will have the last word.
Okay, so I'm hoping this will address some of the issues that you raised, Brian, but I think there are two very, really difficult challenge for us now, and we really need to rise to the occasion. One is that I don't think it's enough that we get the analysis right and the calls right. I think we need to make sure that we actually start fights, to campaign, to fight for actual things that are important to people in the here and now, and use these fights not only to get these wins, but also to be able to promote that analysis and the more strategic calls that we have for system change. And those fights are important and challenging because we also have to make sure that we're also able to draw broad participation and support for these fights. And the challenge is, how do we define some of the immediate demands where we can have this broad unity without letting strategic differences get in the way? Because I don't think we can agree on everything. And if we want to draw a broad movement, that means not necessarily everyone in that movement will be agreeing with our sharper, more radical analysis, or with our far more strategic vision for system change. So those fights, I think, are really in order now. And there were great questions in the Q&A and in the chats about what are the arenas, what are some of the things we should fight for, and so on and so forth. I think the second challenge for us is the reality in the South is all these fights that we're having in the climate front, in the trade front, now in the debt front, are really about mainly the same movements taking on this challenge. And so it's about mustering and I really feel it right now, especially at my age, mustering the energy and the strength and the time to be taking the lead and pushing in all these many different fronts. And of course, one of the answers to that, and that's also expressed in the chat, is how we make the linkages. So we're not creating new movements, we're challenging the same movements in the South to take on debt again and make it part of the fights that they're doing today. Thank you. And thank you everyone for such great questions and points in the chat and the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Lidy. And I think we did a bit of a disservice by not foregrounding the questions in the Q&A, and I'm sure people will forgive us because it's about managing all the different aspects of a Zoom and not being immediately in touch with everybody. But let's see what we can do in saving those questions and coming back to them, because I'm hoping this is not the first and last of these discussions. Beverly.
We may not win the fight against debt, but we will become experts in
unmute.
Zoom. I have unmuted. You just can't hear me, dear.
Yeah, I can actually hear Beverly.
I hear you, Beverly. No problem.
Yeah.
I think people hear you.
Okay. Let me also just, I think, comment on that. Obviously, the question is how we make the linkages is vital. And Jubilee South America's, in a sense, began in this sense. Obviously, there's much history, and we're going to go into that now. But before the recent round of IMF and World Bank meetings, as the pandemic was just beginning to settle into our countries, in fact, we took an initial step in trying to see, how we could build some of those linkages, and produced a regional statement calling for debt suspension, for cancellation, for annulment. We have a real problem with the word cancellation in Spanish. But basically classic demands, and also the demand of no new debt in order to face this pandemic. But I also wanted to mention one of the second demands that was made in this regional statement that's signed by a dozen, 15, I don't remember exactly, of the prominent social movements throughout the region, and 100 or so local and nationally based organizations and movements. One of the important demands here was to address, indeed, the issue of household debt, in particularly as it responds to basic human rights. So we face a real problem with water, electricity, gas, communications, these things that we have all identified, and that indeed the global community has identified and has institutionalized as fundamental human rights. And yet we find that these are increasingly service for pay, as education and healthcare also, as part of the results of the past 20 to 40 years of ongoing debt crisis. And at this particular juncture of pandemic, with so many people unable to work, particularly in Latin America, where more than 40% of the labor force is in the informal economy and is facing even more drastic situation than those who actually have formal employment. We see the call for canceling those debts and in a sense putting a clear limit to how people are scabbed for paying, in a sense, for their basic human rights. And this is an area in which we have to look at. We also made a call, importantly, for, in a sense, resuming or renewing, as it were, a call for regional unity and integration at a time when we have, I would say, no leaders in Latin America who are speaking out, like has been said, the governments in the Organization of African Unity. We have indeed much more prominent fascist leadership in a number of countries. And in a number, or in the majority of countries, it's been said, we have leadership politically and economically, which is seeking to improve the conditions of its subordination and nothing beyond that. It's interesting, we do have a call on that from former presidents, from former governments, for some cancellation, not just for income countries. A call which is interesting. It needs to be worked on. It needs to be connected. Figures who were very important in developing the I lost a connection. Maybe you did as well. But the final call that was made by this collection of movements, and both political movements, social movements in Latin America, is indeed for addressing again the call for the IMF and the multilateral financial institutions to frankly get out of the continent, out. And I think this is an additional item that we need to address globally. It's been said and referenced here that the IMF and the World Bank in April were ecstatic. I think that's the best way to describe their reaction to the pandemic, because they've been put back in the center, it would seem, of global politics. And at a time that the IMF is now, I mean, it's ecstatic. It's after 30 years, it's gone back and made an agreement with El Salvador. 10 years after Bolivia got rid of the IMF, now they're back. And this reality that they are, the major financial institutions see this as an enormous boost to their power, to their role, and their role vis-a-vis that of private capital. So I think we have to look also at this reality and see that this is a time to also address the reality of these institutions. Their policies continue to be the same that they have been for more than 40 years. They're part of the problem, they're not part of the solution. And whether that's low interest loans today, which is the offer for most of these institutions, or continuing conditionality, as Eric was explaining, the mechanism of debt cancellation is scandalous, as is the mechanism of interest-free loans, which means that the country continues to condition its policy and its political economy to the demands of the IMF, even if they're not paying interest on the loan. They're paying service, they're paying subservience, subordination. So this is, I think, a particularly important time for us to be refocusing on the role of those institutions and the need to get rid of them. The need for other institutions that really respond to what are the demands of people, what are the needs of people, what are our human rights. And this, just a final note, I think it's also very important for us to recognize and to think about as we try to move forward at this time, the reality that the economic crisis and the financial crisis that we're facing globally today predates the pandemic. It is not just a result of the pandemic. And this means that we need to look much more clearly and need to focus, I think, much more attention on the reality of that crisis as we think about building movement. Is it a crisis of overproduction? Is it really a crisis of inequality? The fact that life for most people around the world is becoming worse and worse, not better. And this is before the pandemic. And the pandemic now runs the risk of being, in a sense, a cover, a disguise that you put over the reality of that crisis, and all of a sudden the crisis is just a result of the pandemic. So we need to be careful about looking at the reality of inequality that is behind this crisis, the concentration of private wealth, of private capital in our global economy, and see that these are the kinds of things that must change, and that the movement that we continue to seek to build and now see that we need to focus much more actively on the debt component, in a sense, of that system, but we really need to have that global and that broad-based focus. And again, just to say, I think we all want to be looking towards future actions. And it's not a discussion that we have completed here in the region, but it seems to me that we need to keep our ear tuned to how we can strengthen calls for unity, calls for debt cancellation, indeed, in a very immediate and very real fights, as Lidy was pointing out, between now and October. Thank you.
Thanks very, very much, Beverly. I have to say I'm very sorry. I missed quite a big part of what you said, not because of your connection, but something happened with my hearing what you were saying. But I got the latter part, and it was very useful and very important points that you brought to our attention, reinforced, etc. I'm going to ask Eric to make some final points before we go to Dottie.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for the inputs from Beverly, Dorothy, and Lidy, and the participants who took the floor and who sent questions. First point, we are confronting a multidimensional global crisis of capitalism. We are entering the major economic crisis in the last 70 years. So we will compare this crisis with the crisis of the 1930s, mainly now in the industrialized countries of the North, but it will expand. It is very clear at a world scale. We are confronted with the main ecological crisis in several centuries. We are confronted with the main health crisis since 70 or 80 years. And the level of political crisis of the system of dominance of the capitalist class in several countries is also very high, looking at what is happening in the US, but also in several countries in the European Union, it's evident, in Argentina, etc. And at the level of the movement, the movements are more fragile at a world scale and at the level of collaboration than it was 20 years ago. We had last year a very broad movement of rebellion coming from rank and file people without nobody convoking, without nobody organizing. And it was, it created, and I was enthusiastic. But if we are not capable to try and to invest energy to create a new broad social and political movement at a world scale, we will not be able to have victories. We have had huge mobilization, but how many victories? Very few one. We see that people want radical solution. We see that with the support to Bernie Sanders' proposal in the US, with Jeremy Corbyn when he was really radical in 2017, with the Labour manifesto. And we see that in the Global South when radical left movement are trying to build something new and convoking a broad movement. So it's a very existential challenge to try to rebuild something after the disaster of the World Social Forum. So I would agree, if I understood correctly with Lidy, the priority is not to rebuild a new debt, single one issue movement, is to insert, to integrate the question of the debt, or to connect the question of the debt, household debt and public debt, to all the other struggle, which was already what we tried, Jubilee South and CADTM, inside the process of the World Social Forum. We had good initiative between the year 2001 and 2006, 2007. But after that, the World Social Forum entered in a huge crisis. And so the question is, will we be able to, after this meeting, to discuss together, and I saw the message from Britt Brennan from TNI, to try to relaunch something. And to relaunch something, not only integrating the old generation, because Beverly, Brian, Britt, Lidy, and I were part of the old generation. The question is, will we be able to be connected with the youth who has been part of the big climate mobilization in several countries? Will we be able to connect with the new feminist movement, which convoked women's strikes in Argentina, in Chile, in Spain, in Poland, etc.? So will we be able to connect different generations, a different political and social movement, which have priorities, different priorities, but which need to come together? At the level of the specific question of the debt, as CEDTM, we are totally opposed to ask money to the IMF and to the World Bank. IMF and World Bank are part of the problem, not part of the solution. The question is to suspend payment, to audit the debt, to repudiate the debt as a unilateral sovereign act of sovereign government and state based on the support or the pressure of the popular movement. And we don't need to ask money to this type of lenders. And of course, we need fiscal reform, because the rich are, they are very rich person in the north and in the south. In Africa, you have very rich person in South Africa, in Angola and other countries, and we have to tax the wealth of the 1% richest people all over the world. And I finish by that. We need a new broad political and social movement. And I am sure that you, Brian, you, Lidy, Beverly, we will be dialoguing about if we are able to connect with other movements to build something new. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks very much. Dottie, last word to you.
Yeah, I know, and I know that there's not much time, so that's why I requested to post the link to our paper on the global financial reset, because we do agree with many points, and then at the same time the importance of connecting the different issues together. So it's not just about debt, but also we need a global financial reset, and we need to look at it that first. The current way of financial regulation, the way of the global financial order is very short-termist, exploitative, especially to the developing countries, and will lead us just to collapse and all this crisis. So we need financial regulation. They should, the countries in the global south should not be prevented from regulating and control. And I think the key word here is that economic planning should be fashionable again. It was demonized the last 40 years or 30 years, and that this time I think that this health crisis has brought to the center, front and center, that economies and governments need to plan. Otherwise, this will not be the first and last crisis. There would be more pandemics in the future because of the problem also in the environment. And then we need to clamp down on tax havens. We're also pushing together with the campaign on debt cancellation that there should be tax for coronavirus. That it's crazy that the rich, the companies are not paying enough tax, and in fact first in line when it comes to dole out coming from the government. We need to rethink our trade rules. We should not go on. We could not continue with countries signing on to the investment state dispute resettlement, because otherwise we will just see more of the same. And that when governments try to regulate and protect their economies, they will be sued by corporation. We need a just ecological transition. I think that is clear to everyone, and that cooperation is needed. Now I want to jump on the question of how do we encourage the young to join this. I remember I was 14 when I started joining mobilizations on the Bataan nuclear power plant. And I think there is an important understanding. Also, I think it's developing also in the north, because many of the students are are now saddled with student loans. That many of my colleagues are saying that new graduates or many of my friends who have kids entering university are saying that new graduates are now facing 20 to 30,000 pound loan when they graduate, and they have to deal with that. And that means for many that are under 35, they could no longer dream of owning a house or having a better life because they have to pay for debts. So I think the question of debts of the developing country may resound or may connect very well with the youth movement in the global north, because now they understand how it is to be indebted and how their prospect for future are curtailed by their student loans. There's a serious intra and intergenerational equity issues here arising from these debts. The Bataan nuclear power plant that I campaigned for when I was 14, the Philippines is still paying for that until 2025. So these debts are enormous and long-term and really saddening us for many, many years. Maybe in my last point, I just wanted to respond on China here, because there's a question on China. It is true, in fact, that at the moment, it is quite worrying that many of those defaulting on their debts to China end up with their major assets being taken and being taken over by China. So, but many the Chinese government will also say that in the first place, you get what you negotiate for. So for many countries, it is very, very important to negotiate well and to build the power and to have the feeling that they have an equal power. Because first and foremost, the responsibility for that is not just from the debtor countries, it is also for the creditor country. It takes two to tango. The question of how responsible or how democratic the countries in the developing countries are when dealing with that issue is now mute and academic. The debtor countries are equally corrupt, and that should be an equal campaign for both North and the South. And I think for some of our experiences with discussing with the Chinese, I think Lidy would confirm this. It is important to discuss with the Chinese embassies in all the countries when it comes to how their projects or their investments should be best or better managed. And also, before the crisis, I remember 2 years ago that the China gave a debt cancellation to 28 out of 32 LDCs. And now there's a call, and there must be a call for the Chinese to have another round of debt cancellation, especially for countries in Africa, since many of the African countries are now indebted to China. So there should be that push again for the Chinese to address the situation in Africa and the other developing countries. And I think that will be for me for the time being. I know we don't have time anymore. I think that means we need a second, third round of discussion, more assemblies on this, and focus on strategy building. There's a question from Brid that will be difficult to respond to at the moment, because we need to push for governments to discuss and to act as one. I think I mentioned that in my presentation, that this is not for a single country to default alone, but there must be a cluster of countries agreeing not to pay their debts and to have more power. But how can that happen? I think that would need a more strategy session. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Dottie. It's well over 11 o'clock in the Philippines and perhaps later in other Asian countries. Beverly is in a very good place. Martha, your day is starting. Good luck to you. So I'm not going to take long in summarizing and pulling all the very important issues that have been made. I just want to emphasize a couple of points. First of all, I think we all can agree that we need a new global political movement that can link all these different issues together, all the different crises, and particularly linking the ecological crisis to the economic crisis, and the depth of this economic depression that we're facing gives great urgency to that. But what I would like to emphasize and point to you, my comrades who've worked with, who I've worked with for a long time around the issue of debt, we shouldn't underestimate the importance of a movement a specific movement around the debt, which enriches all the other movements. It doesn't mean that we only operate within an anti-debt movement and stop being active in other movements, but I think it's very, very important to understand the way in which the issues of the debt throw light into the workings of the global financial system and the overall architecture and the power relations that reinforce the subordination of the popular classes and the countries in the South and you know, the weaker countries even in the North today. So I think that it is an extremely important initiative, and I get a sense from the posts on the chats and the general interventions here that this should be the first of several discussions that we have. And to look at, I would like to start off with some of the challenges that Lidy gave us right at the beginning, to see if we can't construct through further discussions and at a regional level a common statement that can represent the kind of positions that we've developed here, that doesn't look at the debt as an issue of charity, the cancellation of debt as an issue of charity, as a one-off thing, that it sees it as part of dismantling the structural system that has put us in bondage, that has put us in a situation where we face such deep environmental, ecological crises. So it's the point that I'd like us to end up on, and to ask that we continue to collaborate, the groupings that have co-hosted this in the first instance, those that wish to participate and add their intervention to this process. We will really value that. And what we will do through discussion is work out what should be the follow-up discussion. Perhaps we can also elaborate this at a regional level. In Africa, we would like to do something similar, looking at and following up the issues that the openings of various countries' call for debt cancellation allows, and come together again in a very rich set of discussions that takes not just the movement against the debt forward, but the movement to free us from neoliberal capitalism and the massive problems that we are going to encounter in the next days, weeks, months, and years. The situation that we face is dire, and I foresee possibilities of countries defaulting on their debt, and where the issues that we've raised as anti-debt movements for repudiation, the issues of illegitimacy of debt, coming back central into the attention. And I particularly appreciate the point that you make, Dottie, about linking up with a younger generation, and that to do that through the points that Eric has suggested, that we can't look at the issue of debt simply in terms of state debt, but we've got to look at the debt of our poor households, the peasants, the women, etc. And we've got to, and the students, and we've got to bring this and connect these issues into a broad movement that allows us to challenge the system, which is bringing not just humanity, but other species life into question. So let me thank all the panelists. Let me thank the AIDC cool kids, as they call themselves, the techies that made sure that the technical problems that we face were very minor. And to thank all the people who've joined us and stayed with us over, we've run over half an hour. Thank you very much. And this is not the last of the discussions. I want you to join me in shouting one thing: don't owe, won't pay. Don't owe, won't pay.
Don't owe, won't pay.
Thanks very much.
No debemos, no
comrades.
pagamos. No debemos, no pagamos. Efectivamente. Un abrazo a todos.
As we say in South Africa, amandla.